Well, it was amazing. We were skeptical that a researcher, and a couple of them, Aiko Yoshinaga-Herzig and Peter Irons, uncovered evidence that would lead to reopen this infamous case that occurred, some 36, 37 years earlier. Peter sought us out, and a meeting was held, and he brought with him copies of intelligence files from the FBI, the Federal Communications, the Navy, Justice Department memos that characterized the Army's claims of General DeWitt as, quote, intentional falsehoods and fabrications. Every law student, lawyer is familiar with Korematsu versus United States. It's recognized as one of the worst decisions of the US Supreme Court and characterized as a civil liberties disaster. The idea of reopening that case, especially when it involved our own families and our own community, was unthinkable. So as we saw this, and again, whistleblower memos going back and forth between Justice Department lawyers having really an ethical dilemma about whether they ought to be lying to the US Supreme Court, that was remarkable. The other remarkable thing is that Peter would come to primarily Japanese American attorneys as the means to reopen this case. Well, unlike today, one of the challenges was ignorance. In getting ready for announcing this reopening, this ancient Supreme Court case, I called up news desks, and these are well, educated journalists who they're traffic directors for news that comes in. And when we announced that we were going to reopen Korematsu versus the United States, first question is, well, what's that? And when we talked about the incarceration of Japanese Americans, the journalist said, what's that about? That happened in America. Aren't you talking about Japanese prisoners of war? And I said, no, these are Americans, 120,000 of them, 70,000 who were citizens by birth, removed and taken away into 10 American-style concentration camps. And this was quite remarkable to the journalists. They did immediately gravitate toward it because it involved elements of suppression of evidence, historical wrong, and following Watergate, which was the misconduct by the Nixon administration and the cover-up, was of that nature. And so we happened to hit on a very slow news day, and it was, in many cases, the lead story for network television nationally, as well as front page of the major publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post, as well as local coverage. The message was, although this involved our community, it was a matter of American democracy in which all three institutions of government, the legislative branch, which was Congress, the presidency, and ultimately the judicial branch, all failed and basically collapsed, demonstrating, the perils to democracy when racism shouts louder than the Constitution. There were three things going on here thematically. I mean, one, I think the legal team, as well as the Japanese American community, were out to vindicate our own families. And everybody, of course, knew that the roundup was wrong and they were victims, but the conventional wisdom and the history of the time was that this was a grave mistake. I think the second thing was to impair the legal precedent of Korematsu versus United States, which, stands for the proposition that without evidence, without trial, an entire population of Americans could be deprived of their homes, their property, their businesses, for some even their lives, without any due process whatsoever. So the impairment of that legal dangerous principle was very important. And then the third principle was win or lose this case. It was critical for the sake of American history to make sure that this never happens again to any other group. We did not know at the time how the court was going to rule, Judge Marilyn Hall Patel. The US government had continued to defend these cases on the grounds that there was a military necessity and there was a reason for the roundup. Truth was on the line, facts were on the line, the meaning of the Constitution was on the line. So it was a big day. Well, the fact that the case arose at the same time, contemporaneously, with the Japanese-American Redress and Reparations movement was just luck. Two things that intersected. I mean, Peter Irons was out to investigate and write a book about these momentous decisions, and he happened to cross paths with Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig, who was hired as a researcher for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And the two of them just struck a fast friendship and shared information. The fact that the timing of the case and Judge Patel's ruling coincided with the movement and the lobbying effort going on for the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and that whole movement was an incredible good fortune. Equivalence, again, between what happened to us and what's happened historically tracing back to 1619. There just isn't. It's not comparable. On the other hand, the movement for reconciliation, the movement for acknowledgement, and some form of monetary atonement is directly applicable. The racial profiling aspect, the failure of democracy, and the cultural norms that make racist, systemic exclusion completely normal and acceptable, that's the same. So I think there are certainly great differences, but certainly there are great similarities. I think it also reflects what I'll call the racial hierarchy, and that is the racial atmosphere that propped up the institution of slavery and justified it for 2.5 centuries, 246 years, plus another 90 years of Jim Crow. That set the racial environment for everybody else. I think that dominant cultural thinking infects everybody. And because this is America, among other things, the first people see is race, with all the biases and the stereotypes that come with it. This is a much deeper thing than just Black reparations. It really shines a light on how the country needs to fix itself. And so, again, another reason why this is not just a Black issue, but it's an American issue we all ought to be reckoning with. And because Japanese Americans have had direct experience, I think it's incumbent upon us to get involved in this. Well, to be mentioned in the same breath as Cliff Uyeda is an honor. I met him shortly after I graduated from law school when he was championing the Aiva Taguri pardon and exoneration. And it was an uphill fight. I mean, that one where she was falsely accused of espionage and disloyalty, and that was amplified by Hollywood, was, an amazing battle that he led. And then he also was an early adopter for Japanese American reparations and later championing other civil rights and humanitarian rights. And so I think he was a model of integrity, and anyone who met him, I think, was influenced by him in that regard. And so to be associated with him in any capacity is an honor. And I think he is one of the people, heroes of the Japanese American community to look towards, and a role model.